Mitch sat in the corner of his apartment long after the shimmer had disappeared. His body was motionless, but his mind raced, consumed by questions that offered no clear answers. What he had experienced was too vivid, too tangible to dismiss as another hallucination. The warmth, the voices, the fleeting images of his dream family. They had felt as real as anything in his waking life. He pressed his hands to his face, trying to reconcile the impossible with the reality he had known since waking from his coma. The lines between memory, grief, and imagination had blurred beyond recognition. In the days that followed, Mitch became consumed by the need to understand what had happened. He scoured books and online forums, searching for any explanation that might fit. He read about altered states of consciousness, the effects of trauma on the mind, and theories about parallel universes and alternate realities. None of it provided the clarity he sought, but each fragment of information added fuel to his growing obsession. The shimmer had been a doorway, he was certain of it, a connection to the life he had lost, or perhaps a version of it that existed somewhere beyond his reach. His search for answers drove him deeper into isolation. He stopped attending therapy sessions, convinced that the professionals couldn't help him. Their attempts to ground him in the present felt dismissive, as though they were denying the existence of something Mitch knew to be real. He withdrew from the world almost entirely, his days spent poring over his findings and replaying the moment in the corner of his apartment when he had felt closest to his family. The strange occurrences in Mitch's apartment grew more frequent. Objects continued to appear and disappear, their presence tied to memories from his dream life. A framed photograph of Kayla and the children appeared on his nightstand one morning, only to vanish by evening. He found his daughter's favorite stuffed animal tucked under his pillow, its soft fabric still carrying the faint scent of her. Mitch began to wonder if these objects were slipping through the same doorway he had glimpsed, remnants of a world he no longer inhabited. The shimmering corner became a focal point of Mitch's existence. He rearranged his furniture to clear the area, leaving it bare except for a single chair where he could sit and watch for any sign of the phenomenon's return. Hours turned into days as he waited, his eyes fixed on the empty space, his mind replaying the fleeting sensations of the last encounter. He barely slept, his body sustained only by the faint hope that the shimmer might return and offer him a way back to the life he had lost. One night, as Mitch sat in his usual spot, the air in the room grew heavy once again. The temperature dropped, and the faint red glow began to flicker in the corner. Mitch's heart raced as he stood, every nerve in his body taut with anticipation. The shimmer reappeared, brighter and more defined than before. It pulsated rhythmically, casting faint patterns of light across the walls. Mitch took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat as the hum of energy filled the room. As he reached out toward the shimmer, the warmth enveloped him once more. His vision blurred, and the images of his dream family returned, more vivid and detailed than ever. He saw Kayla standing in the kitchen, her back turned as she hummed softly to herself. His daughter sat at the table, her hands busy with a coloring book, while his son played on the floor with his toy car. The scene was so serene, so achingly familiar, that Mitch felt tears welling in his eyes. The voices were clearer this time. He could hear Kayla's laughter, the children's excited chatter, and the hum of life that had been absent from his world for so long. Mitch's hand trembled as he reached further into the shimmer, desperate to step through and join them. But as he moved, the scene began to waver, the edges blurring like a reflection disturbed by ripples. The warmth turned to a searing heat, and the hum grew into a deafening roar. Mitch staggered back, his vision swimming as the shimmer collapsed in on itself, leaving the room dark and silent once more. He fell to his knees, his chest heaving with sobs as the weight of his loss crashed over him anew. The doorway had been there, so tantalizingly close, yet still beyond his reach. Mitch's heart ached with the knowledge that he had glimpsed his family once again, only to lose them all over. In the days that followed, Mitch continued his vigil, though his hope was tinged with despair. The shimmer did not return, and the objects tied to his dream life stopped appearing. The apartment grew cold and lifeless, a stark contrast to the warmth of the scenes Mitch had glimpsed. Though he clung to the belief that the doorway was real, the doubt began to creep in, whispering insidious questions about his sanity. Mitch's reality had fractured irreparably, leaving him stranded between two worlds. One was the life he inhabited now, empty, silent, and devoid of meaning. The other was the life he had known in his dreams, vibrant and filled with love, yet forever out of reach. He could no longer distinguish where one ended and the other began, his existence a fragile balancing act between memory and madness. Mitch's heart ached with the impossible longing to reclaim the life he had lost, even as the truth loomed ever larger, a shadow he could never escape. The world around Mitch dissolved into a haze of red light and oppressive noise. The lamp had grown far beyond the corner where it once stood, its pulsating glow enveloping the entire room. Mitch could no longer discern the walls, the furniture, or even the boundaries of the space. Everything had been consumed by the lamp's presence. The voices that had begun as faint whispers now roared in his ears, unintelligible but filled with an overwhelming sense of urgency and dread. The pain in his head became unbearable, a searing pressure that felt as though his skull might fracture at any moment. Mitch clawed at his temples, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. He tried to ground himself, to remember where he was, but the reality he had known felt like a distant memory. All that existed was the lamp and its terrible, unrelenting presence. Time lost meaning as Mitch sat immobilized, trapped in a nightmare he could not escape. The red glow seemed to pulse in time with his racing heartbeat, growing brighter with each thundering beat. Shapes began to emerge within the light, twisting and writhing in ways that defied explanation. They moved with a purpose, converging toward him as though drawn by an unseen force. Mitch could feel their presence, their weight pressing down on him, though he could not comprehend what they were. The voices shifted, their chaotic cacophony merging into a single, rhythmic chant. The sound resonated deep within Mitch, vibrating through his very bones. It was both inside and outside of him, an omnipresent force that seemed to pull at the edges of his sanity. His vision blurred, the red light distorting into patterns that danced and spiraled, dragging his focus deeper into the lamp's incomprehensible realm. In the midst of this overwhelming chaos, Mitch felt a sudden, jarring sensation. It was as if he were being pulled backward, yanked away from the lamp by an invisible hand. The red light grew dimmer, the voices fading into the distance, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that filled his ears. The shapes within the glow dissolved, and the pulsating rhythm slowed until it ceased entirely. For a brief moment, there was silence. When Mitch opened his eyes, he was no longer in his living room. He was lying on a hard, cold surface, his body aching and disoriented. The harsh light of the sun streamed down on him, blinding after the suffocating darkness of the lamp's glow. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Slowly, the world came into focus, and Mitch realized he was outside. He was sprawled on a sidewalk, the rough concrete pressing against his back. Around him, a crowd had gathered, their faces blurred by the brightness of the daylight. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and concern, their murmured voices blending into an indistinct hum. Mitch tried to sit up, his muscles protesting with sharp pangs of pain. His head throbbed, the residual echoes of the lamp's oppressive presence still reverberating through his mind. As his vision cleared further, Mitch began to recognize the familiar architecture of the campus where he had attended college. The realization struck him like a blow, jolting his mind into a chaotic spiral of questions. How had he ended up here? Where were Kayla and the kids? The perfect life he had known felt impossibly distant, like a dream fading upon waking. Mitch's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the crowd, searching for the faces of his wife and children, but they were nowhere to be found. Before Mitch could fully process what was happening, a police officer pushed through the crowd and approached him. The officer's expression was stern yet laced with urgency. Strong hands gripped Mitch's arms, helping him to his feet before guiding him toward a nearby patrol car. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their voices mingling with Mitch's own racing thoughts. He struggled to understand what they were saying, but the words refused to coalesce into anything coherent. The officer opened the back door of the patrol car and eased Mitch inside. The vehicle's interior was cool and dim, a stark contrast to the blinding sunlight outside. Mitch's mind raced as the car began to move, the world outside the windows passing by in a blur. He felt as though he were caught between two worlds, the life he had known and the harsh reality pressing in around him. The pounding in his head grew stronger as fragments of memory and sensation fought for dominance. The lamp, the red light, the voices, they all seemed to pull at him, demanding his attention even as the world outside the car screamed for clarity. Mitch closed his eyes, trying to push the chaos aside, but the weight of the realization building in his chest was impossible to ignore. The life he had lived, the family he had cherished, the home he had built, it was all gone. Or perhaps it had never existed at all. The truth loomed just beyond the edge of comprehension, a shadow that threatened to engulf him entirely. Mitch's chest tightened as the first flicker of realization took root, a devastating certainty that shattered everything he thought he knew. The ride to the hospital was a blur of confusion and dread. Mitch's mind churned with fragmented memories and sensations, each more disjointed than the last. The rhythmic rumble of the patrol car offered no solace, only amplifying the dissonance between what he thought he knew and what he was now facing. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists, his knuckles white against the dim interior of the vehicle. He tried to force himself to focus, to anchor his thoughts in something concrete, but every attempt only unraveled further into chaos. When they arrived at the hospital, Mitch was whisked away into a sterile, brightly lit examination room. The antiseptic smell stung his nostrils, grounding him momentarily in the present. A flurry of nurses and doctors surrounded him, their movements brisk and methodical. They spoke to one another in clipped tones, their words clinical and detached. Mitch caught fragments of their conversations, mentions of head trauma, possible concussion, and neurological assessments, but they felt distant and irrelevant. None of it explained the gnawing void in his chest, the sense that something far more profound had been taken from him. As he lay on the hospital bed, staring up at the harsh fluorescent lights, the realization began to take shape. Came slowly, piece by agonizing piece, like a puzzle being assembled in reverse. The life he had lived for the past 10 years, the love he had shared with Kayla, the joy of raising their 2 children, the warmth of their home. It was all unraveling before his eyes. The memories that had once felt so vivid and real now seemed brittle and hollow, as though they had been nothing more than shadows on a wall. The doctor's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts, drawing his attention back to the present. He was informed of the events that had led him to the hospital. A violent altercation on campus, a blow to the head, and a subsequent fall had left him unconscious. The details were stark and simple, devoid of the emotional weight that Mitch was now drowning in. He listened numbly, his mind barely registering the words. The truth was undeniable, yet impossible to fully grasp. The life Mitch had cherished was not real. It had been a hallucination, a cruel trick played by his own mind during the hours he lay unconscious. The past 10 years, every moment he had cherished, every bond he had treasured, had been nothing more than an elaborate dream. The realization was a jagged knife, carving through him with merciless precision. Mitch's body trembled as the weight of the revelation settled over him. The memories that had once been his greatest source of joy now became a torment, a constant reminder of what he had never truly had. The sound of his daughter's laughter, the warmth of Kayla's touch, the sight of his son sleeping peacefully in his crib. They were all fragments of a reality that existed only in his mind. The life he had built was a mirage, fading with each passing second as he tried desperately to cling to it. The days that followed were a blur of grief and despair. Mitch was released from the hospital with a clean bill of physical health, but his mind remained shattered. The doctors referred him to a therapist, someone who could help him navigate the overwhelming loss he felt. Yet the sessions offered little relief. Mitch struggled to articulate the depth of his pain, the profound sense of emptiness that consumed him. Each night, Mitch lay awake in his small, unfamiliar apartment, staring at the ceiling as the memories of his dream life played in his mind. He saw Kayla's smile, heard his children's voices, and felt the warmth of a home that no longer existed. The memories were vivid and relentless, haunting him with their clarity. He longed for the comfort they had once brought, but now they were a cruel reminder of what he had lost. Mitch began to isolate himself, retreating further into his own mind. The world outside felt distant and uninviting, a stark contrast to the vibrant, loving life he had once known. He stopped answering calls from friends and family, unable to face their well-meaning concern. Their questions and reassurances only deepened the chasm between the life he had lived and the reality he now faced. Grief enveloped Mitch like a heavy shroud, suffocating and inescapable. He grieved not only for the family he had lost but for the version of himself who had been whole and happy. The man he was now felt like a hollow shell, defined only by the absence of what he had once believed to be real. Mitch's days became a blur of emptiness, his mind consumed by the ghosts of a life that had never truly existed. Mitch's days became a blur of sameness, each one bleeding into the next with little to differentiate them. The weight of his loss, though constant, began to manifest in stranger, more unsettling ways. At first, it was small things, faint echoes of laughter that seemed to linger just out of reach, the sensation of movement in his peripheral vision, or the subtle scent of Kayla's perfume in the empty apartment. Mitch dismissed these as tricks of his grieving mind, desperate attempts to cling to a life that had never truly existed. As time passed, these moments grew more vivid, more insistent. He began to hear the voices of his children with startling clarity, calling out to him from another room. They were unmistakable, their tones so familiar it made his chest ache. Yet, whenever Mitch followed the sounds, the rooms he entered were always empty, filled only with the oppressive silence that had come to define his existence. He told himself it was stress, exhaustion, or perhaps his subconscious betraying him once again. But the doubt lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. The boundaries between memory and reality began to blur. Mitch started noticing objects in his apartment that didn't belong to him. A small toy car on the coffee table, a crayon drawing taped to the refrigerator. These items were always familiar, tied to specific memories from his dream life. The toy car belonged to his son, a favorite he had carried everywhere, while the drawing was one his daughter had proudly shown him after an afternoon of coloring. Mitch would stare at these objects for hours, unsure whether he was losing his grip on reality or if something far stranger was happening. His dreams became darker, more fragmented. They were no longer the comforting glimpses of his dream family that had once provided a bittersweet escape. Instead, they were distorted and surreal, filled with shadowy figures and disjointed scenes. He would find himself wandering through his old home, its walls warped and decaying, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. He would hear Kayla's voice calling to him, but it always sounded distant, as though coming from the other side of a vast, unbridgeable chasm. The dreams often ended with the same haunting image: his son, standing at the edge of a dark, empty room. The boy's lips would move, forming words Mitch could never hear, his small face etched with a sadness that mirrored Mitch's own. Each time, Mitch would wake drenched in sweat, his heart racing and his mind filled with questions he couldn't answer. The strangeness began to seep into Mitch's waking life in ways he couldn't ignore. He started noticing subtle changes in his surroundings, furniture shifting slightly from where he had left it, pictures on the walls that didn't belong to him, and shadows that moved when they shouldn't. The air in his apartment felt heavier, charged with a sense of something unseen yet undeniably present. Mitch began to wonder if he was truly alone, or if some remnant of his dream life had followed him into reality. One evening, as Mitch sat on the couch staring blankly at the television, he felt a sudden, sharp chill run down his spine. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and the air felt thick and oppressive. Mitch's breath caught in his throat as he noticed a faint red glow flickering in the corner of the room. His heart pounded as he turned his head, half expecting to see the lamp from his dream life, the object that had once consumed him. But the corner was empty, save for a faint shimmer in the air. like heat waves rising from asphalt on a summer day. Mitch rubbed his eyes, willing the shimmer to disappear, but it remained, pulsating faintly in the dim light. He felt an inexplicable pull toward it, an almost magnetic force drawing him in. Against his better judgment, Mitch stood and walked toward the corner, his movements slow and deliberate. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, growing stronger as he approached. When Mitch reached out, his hand passed through the shimmer, and a sudden wave of warmth spread through his body. His vision blurred, and for a brief moment, he felt as though he were standing in another place entirely. He could hear Kayla's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling his name. He saw flashes of his dream family, his daughter laughing as she ran through the yard, his son holding his hand, and Kayla smiling at him from across the room. The images were so vivid they left him breathless, his heart aching with a desperate longing. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shimmer vanished, leaving Mitch standing alone in the corner of his empty apartment. The room was silent once more, the air still and lifeless. Mitch sank to the floor, his mind racing. The encounter had felt so real, more real than anything he had experienced since waking from his dream life. It left him questioning everything: his grief, his memories, and the very fabric of reality itself. Mitch was the kind of man who seemed to have it all. By his final semester at college in Louisiana, his life was already falling into place. It was during this time that he first saw Kayla, another senior who exuded warmth and charm. From the moment he laid eyes on her, Mitch knew he had found the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. She didn't make it easy for him, though. Kayla had a way of maintaining an air of mystery, playing hard to get in a way that only deepened Mitch's determination. For months, he pursued her, pouring his heart into winning her over. Eventually, his persistence paid off, and the two began a relationship that felt like the beginning of a lifelong journey. After graduation, Mitch and Kayla chose to stay in Louisiana. They rented a modest apartment in the city while they started building their careers. Their days were filled with the hustle of new beginnings, but the evenings were reserved for each other, a time when they would dream about the future they were building together. 2 years passed in what felt like a blink, and before long, the couple stood hand in hand exchanging vows. Their wedding was small but heartfelt, attended by close family and friends who marveled at the connection the two shared. Not long after their marriage, Kayla discovered she was pregnant. The news came as a blessing, perfectly timed with Mitch's rapidly advancing career. He had landed a position at a reputable firm, and his dedication and drive were quickly earning him recognition and promotions. With his financial stability on the rise, Kayla decided to take some time off from work to prepare for their growing family. When their daughter was born, Mitch's joy was boundless. Holding her for the first time, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose and pride. As Mitch's career flourished, so did their home. They moved into a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood, a place they dreamed their children would grow up in. Kayla decided to remain at home full-time, dedicating herself to their daughter and, later, to their son, who was born 2 years later. Mitch supported her decision wholeheartedly, grateful that his career allowed them this kind of stability. It was a picturesque life, the kind that seemed pulled from the pages of a storybook. Mitch relished his role as a father. Each morning before work, he would quietly sneak into his children's rooms to watch them sleep, marveling at the peaceful innocence on their faces. Evenings were sacred family time. They would gather around the dinner table, sharing meals that Kayla prepared with care. Laughter filled the air as they played board games and told stories, their lives interwoven in a tapestry of love and connection. These moments became the foundation of Mitch's happiness, a perfect rhythm that defined his days. For Mitch, everything about his life felt right. His wife was his rock, his children his greatest pride, and his career a testament to his hard work and ambition. He often thought about how lucky he was, how everything had fallen into place so seamlessly. His past struggles and uncertainties seemed distant, replaced by a life of fulfillment and joy. The future stretched out before him, promising more of the same, a steady march of milestones and memories yet to be made. Mitch's perfect life was not without its small challenges. the kind that only served to highlight how strong and supportive his family was. They faced them together, united in their shared purpose. Whether it was late nights soothing a crying baby, balancing budgets, or simply juggling the daily demands of parenthood, Mitch and Kayla approached it all as a team. Their bond was unshakable, their love for each other unwavering. Yet even as everything seemed to be going right, there was an undercurrent of disbelief that Mitch could never quite shake. He occasionally wondered how he had been so fortunate. Life, after all, had a way of being unpredictable, often cruel in its indifference. But these thoughts were fleeting, easily dismissed as he returned to the warmth of his home, the laughter of his children, and the loving embrace of his wife. Mitch's life was a dream, and he lived it as though nothing could wake him from it. As the years passed, Mitch continued to thrive in his career, earning the admiration of his colleagues and the financial security that allowed his family to live comfortably. Kayla excelled in her role as a stay-at-home mother, creating a nurturing environment that Mitch was endlessly grateful for. Together, they carved out a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary, a testament to the power of love and determination. For Mitch, his world was complete. Every morning brought the promise of another day, surrounded by the people he loved most, and every evening reaffirmed the bonds that held them all together. It was the kind of life many dream of but few achieve, a perfect existence that seemed immune to the hardships and uncertainties of the outside world. Mitch had everything he could ever want, and for a time he believed it would last forever. It began as a subtle oddity, an occurrence so insignificant that Mitch almost ignored it entirely. One evening, while lounging on the couch in the living room, his gaze fell on the red lamp in the corner. Something about it seemed off. At first, it was difficult to pinpoint exactly what was wrong. The lamp's glow appeared blurry, as though viewed through a warped lens, even though the rest of the room was perfectly sharp and clear. Mitch blinked a few times, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The lamp still appeared strangely unfocused. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, and inspected the lamp from his seat. It was the same lamp that had always been there. Nothing extraordinary about it. Its deep red shade cast a warm, soothing glow that filled the corner of the room. But now, no matter how intently Mitch focused on it, the blurriness wouldn't resolve. It was as though the object itself was slipping out of reality, refusing to be fully seen. Mitch dismissed the oddity with a shrug, chalking it up to tiredness. After all, he had been working long hours and juggling his responsibilities at home. He turned his attention back to the television, attempting to immerse himself in the program he had been watching. Yet, out of the corner of his eye, the lamp's strange, blurry glow persisted, drawing his attention back like a splinter in his mind. The longer he tried to ignore it, the more unsettling it became. Finally, unable to suppress his curiosity, Mitch stood and walked over to the lamp. Up close, he realized the entire object, not just its glow, seemed distorted, as though it were a mirage flickering in and out of focus. He reached out to touch it, his fingers grazing the cool surface of the shade. It felt solid and normal, yet visually it was anything but. Mitch stepped back and surveyed the rest of the room. Everything else appeared perfectly fine. The bookshelf stood neatly against the wall, the coffee table was in its usual place, and the television continued playing. Only the lamp defied logic. Unease settled in his chest as he considered the possibility that something might be wrong with him. Perhaps his eyes were playing tricks on him, or worse, perhaps his mind was. He quickly dismissed the thought, reassuring himself that it was a temporary anomaly, a fleeting trick of the light or exhaustion. Returning to the couch, Mitch tried to immerse himself in his show once more, but the lamp's blurry presence was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every movement of his head seemed to pull his eyes toward it. He found himself glancing at it repeatedly, almost involuntarily, each time hoping to find it returned to normal. Instead, it seemed to grow more distorted, its lines and edges twisting unnaturally. A wave of discomfort washed over him. His chest felt tight, his thoughts clouded with a nagging worry that he couldn't quite articulate. Still, Mitch resisted the urge to say anything to Kayla or the children. He didn't want to alarm them, nor did he want to acknowledge the absurdity of being disturbed by a household object. He resolved to let it go, convincing himself that he would wake up the next morning and find everything back to normal. But the next day, the lamp remained the same. Mitch avoided it as much as he could, opting to stay out of the living room entirely. Yet, by evening, curiosity and frustration drove him back to the couch, where he once again found himself staring at the blurry red light in the corner. It consumed his attention, leaving him restless and unable to focus on anything else. Over the following days, Mitch's fascination with the lamp turned into an obsession. He began spending hours sitting on the couch, fixated on the way the lamp seemed to warp and shift before his eyes. Sometimes it appeared to tremble, as though it were alive. Other times it seemed to rotate slightly, its glow casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. Mitch's sense of time grew hazy as he sat there, hypnotized by the lamp's inexplicable behavior. Kayla noticed his odd behavior almost immediately. Mitch, usually attentive and engaged, had become distant and preoccupied. He stopped going to work, claiming he felt unwell, though he offered no specifics. His once joyous presence at the dinner table became a hollow shell of itself. He barely responded to his wife or children, his thoughts perpetually drawn back to the corner of the living room. As the days wore on, the lamp's distortions seemed to intensify. Its glow deepened, its edges became harder to define, and at times, it seemed to pulse faintly, as though it had a heartbeat. Mitch began to feel a growing sense of unease, as though the lamp were not just an object but something more, something watching him, drawing him in. Despite Kayla's gentle prodding and insistence that he see a doctor, Mitch refused to acknowledge his growing obsession. He assured her he simply needed rest, though in reality, he spent his nights sneaking downstairs to sit in front of the lamp, watching it for hours on end. Each night, it grew harder to look away. Mitch's world had become an endless cycle of mourning. The grief was unlike anything he had ever known, an all-encompassing void that refused to diminish with time. It was the kind of pain that could not be shared, no matter how many therapists or support groups he turned to. The people around him saw a man grappling with a strange and surreal loss, but none of them could truly understand the depth of his anguish. To Mitch, it felt as though he had been ripped from one life and unceremoniously dropped into another, left to wander as a ghost in a reality he didn't recognize. The memories of his dream life were relentless. They would flood his mind at the most unexpected moments, vivid and detailed in ways that made them impossible to dismiss. He could recall the exact shade of Kayla's hair when the sunlight hit it, the sound of his daughter's giggle when he pretended to be a monster chasing her around the living room, and the way his son's tiny hand had gripped his finger during those early days of fatherhood. These memories felt more real than anything in his current existence, and their weight pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. Every morning, Mitch woke with a fleeting sense of disorientation. For a few precious seconds, he would believe he was back in his home, with Kayla and the kids just a few rooms away. But reality would soon assert itself, harsh and unforgiving. The small, unfamiliar apartment he now called home was stark and impersonal, a glaring reminder of the life he had left behind. The silence that greeted him each day was unbearable, a sharp contrast to the lively chaos he remembered so vividly. Mitch found himself wandering through the days in a daze, unable to engage with the world around him. Simple tasks, like grocery shopping or paying bills, felt meaningless in the shadow of his loss. He would often find himself pausing in the middle of an aisle or staring out a window, his thoughts consumed by memories of the life he had built in his mind. The ache in his chest was constant, a physical manifestation of the emotional void that had taken root within him. Therapy sessions became a weekly ritual, though Mitch often felt they did little to alleviate his pain. His therapist encouraged him to confront the memories and explore his feelings, but the process was excruciating. Each session forced Mitch to relive the joy of his dream life and the crushing realization that it had never been real. He would leave the office drained, his mind weighed down by the impossible task of reconciling the two realities. Mitch began avoiding places and activities that reminded him of his dream family. He stopped going to the park where he had once imagined playing with his children, and he avoided restaurants that served dishes Kayla might have loved. The world seemed littered with landmines of memory, each one threatening to unravel him further. Even mundane objects, a toy in a store window, a family photo on a billboard, could trigger a wave of grief so intense it left him reeling. Despite his efforts to suppress the memories, they found ways to creep into his dreams. In the quiet hours of the night, Mitch's mind would conjure vivid scenes of his dream family. He would see Kayla smiling at him from across the kitchen table, hear his daughter's voice calling for him to join her in the yard, and feel the weight of his son resting against his chest as they napped on the couch. These dreams were both a blessing and a curse. For a few fleeting moments, Mitch felt whole again, only to wake and be thrust back into the cold, unyielding reality of his solitude. The most haunting dreams were the ones where his son appeared. In these dreams, the boy was always 5 years old, standing just on the edge of Mitch's vision. He never spoke, but his lips moved as though he were trying to communicate. Mitch would strain to hear the words, his heart aching with the desperate need to understand. But the boy's voice never reached him. The dreams left Mitch feeling hollow, their unresolved nature amplifying the pain of his loss. As the weeks turned into months, Mitch's isolation deepened. He withdrew from friends and family, unable to face their pity or their well-meaning attempts to help. He stopped answering their calls and texts, retreating further into the cocoon of his grief. The world outside his apartment seemed foreign and uninviting, a place he no longer belonged. Mitch tried to find solace in small routines, clinging to the semblance of normalcy they provided. He would spend hours organizing and reorganizing the few belongings he had, as though imposing order on his environment might somehow bring order to his mind. But no matter how meticulously he arranged his life, the emptiness remained. Mitch was a man adrift, untethered from the world around him and lost in the echo of a life that had never truly existed. Mitch's fixation on the lamp deepened into something far beyond curiosity. It had become an unrelenting compulsion, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. Every night, after Kayla and the children had gone to bed, he would creep downstairs, moving as though in a trance. The house, usually a place of warmth and comfort, seemed different in these late hours. Shadows stretched longer, and silence pressed heavily on his ears, broken only by the faint hum of the lamp's eerie red glow. He would sink onto the couch and stare at it, unable to tear his eyes away. The lamp no longer resembled the unassuming piece of furniture it once was. Its contours shifted and morphed, sometimes stretching upward as though it were growing, other times contracting into unnatural shapes. Its glow seemed alive, pulsating faintly, as if it were breathing. Mitch was mesmerized, unable to look away despite the mounting dread clawing at the edges of his mind. The hours passed in a blur during these nightly vigils. Mitch would sit motionless, his body stiff and his mind trapped in a loop of fascination and terror. Time lost meaning in these moments. He would blink, and suddenly the soft light of dawn would be creeping through the windows, casting pale streaks across the walls. Each morning, Kayla found him slumped on the couch, his face pale and his eyes hollowed by exhaustion. Mitch knew his behavior was spiraling out of control. He was aware of the concerned looks from Kayla, the way she lingered in the doorway, watching him as he sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the corner. He could feel the weight of her unspoken questions, but he couldn't bring himself to explain. How could he? How could he tell her that an ordinary lamp had taken hold of his mind, warping his perception of reality? He avoided Kayla's gentle insistence that he see a doctor, brushing off her worries with vague assurances that he just needed rest. In truth, Mitch was terrified. Deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't decide whether the source of his unease was the lamp itself or his own deteriorating mental state. The thought that his mind might be unraveling filled him with a fear he couldn't face. Days turned into weeks, and the lamp continued to dominate Mitch's every waking thought. Its presence seemed to expand, as though it were bleeding into the fabric of his reality. At times, it felt like the room itself was being consumed by its glow. The red light, once confined to the lamp's shade, began to stretch outward, spilling onto the walls and floor in strange, flickering patterns. Mitch started to see the glow in other parts of the house, faintly reflecting off surfaces where it shouldn't be. His physical health began to decline. His skin grew pale and dark circles ringed his eyes. He barely ate, and the energy that had once driven his career and family life drained away completely. Mitch existed in a haze, his thoughts tethered to the lamp even when he wasn't in the room with it. He started avoiding his children, unable to face their curious questions about why Daddy was acting so strangely. Even Kayla, his anchor through so many challenges, began to feel like a stranger to him. One night, as Mitch sat on the couch, staring at the lamp, a strange sensation washed over him. The edges of his vision blurred, and the room seemed to tilt slightly, as though the very ground beneath him were shifting. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision, but the sensation only grew stronger. The lamp's glow brightened, its red light intensifying until it filled the entire room. It was no longer a soft, inviting light but a harsh, searing presence that seemed to press against his skin. Mitch's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the lamp twist and writhe, its shape no longer even remotely resembling the object he had known. It expanded and contracted rhythmically, its movements almost organic. For the first time, Mitch felt certain that the lamp was more than just an object. It was something else, something alive, and it was watching him just as intently as he had been watching it. His body refused to move, rooted to the spot as the lamp's glow seemed to reach out toward him. A sharp pain blossomed in his head, radiating outward until it felt like his skull was about to split apart. He clutched at his temples, his breathing shallow and ragged. The voices began then, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. They were distant, unintelligible, and filled with an urgency that set his nerves on edge. As the voices grew louder, the lamp seemed to pulse in time with them, its glow becoming almost blinding. Mitch felt as though the room was collapsing around him, the walls closing in as the lamp's presence consumed everything. The pain in his head reached a crescendo, and his vision swam with shadows and bursts of red light. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperate for it all to stop, but the voices and the light followed him into the darkness.